Greetings and welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Matt Locke and our guest today is Daniel Clark. Daniel is a PhD candidate at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. He currently researches how entrepreneurs and MBAs studying entrepreneurship use their idiosyncratic knowledge and perceptions of the international domain, and specific countries in particular, when making internationalization decisions. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So would you like to take the first couple minutes to discuss the background of your study?
Sure. My research really looks at understanding how when entrepreneurs are looking at the entire world, 170 odd countries, and trying to decide where they want to internationalize their business. Currently, most domestic entrepreneurs in the United States, less than 20% actually get more than 25% of their revenues from exports. So understanding how they view the world and how they look at internationalization is a pretty important topic. So what we found and what we really looked at is how their international experiences, how much they've traveled, how they actually view the world truly does influence where they choose to internationalize to. So what we did was we looked at the entrepreneur, where they traveled to, what their experience was, and how much they actually felt they knew, their perception of knowledge, and how that influenced what they were, how they looked at where their potential internationalization targets were, how they analyzed those targets, and how they eventually decided where they wanted to internationalize their business to. We see this as being particularly relevant when we look at the recent failure of Target, who, they made a very simple decision. They were a United States-based company, said, hey, Canada's right next door, they're pretty similar to the United States, let's go there, because we feel we're pretty familiar with them. They went in there not really understanding the market, and they made a huge investment, something in the order of $5 billion, and 2 years later, they are actually withdrawing from the Canadian market because it was pretty much a massive failure for them.
So how did you become interested in this topic to begin with?
It kind of starts in a rather strange way. Number one was, imagine you're going to a restaurant like the Cheesecake Factory, where the menu is like 40 pages long and there's like 600 items on it. How do you decide, if you've never been there before, what you're going to have other than probably cheesecake? So that was one of the first things, is like when you're faced with a very complex, very large decision where you have no knowledge, how do you actually decide what you're going to do? And then when I was taking one of my doctoral seminars, we were presented with a very famous paradigm called the Uppsala model. And essentially they did a bunch of research in the 70s and looked at how companies decided where they were going to internationalize to. And there's a little line buried in there that says, we look at all these different factors about distance and knowledge and how they influence decision, but we take absolutely no credence in how the individual decision maker approaches the decision. So they're saying, well, we know what firms do, but we don't know what individuals do, and how individuals face complex decisions, how they internalize that information and understand that. Well, my background is in psychology. And I know if there's one thing individuals do, they like to simplify complex decisions. They like to use heuristics. They like to eliminate the complexities as much as humanly possible. So that's why I go back to the Cheesecake Factory analogy. You go to what you know. You go to, maybe I've had this kind of pasta before. I've had this kind of pizza before. I like these kinds of flavors. And you use that to get rid of all the things you don't know. And so you go back to what's familiar. And so that was where I was really interested in. What I tried to do is understand how an entrepreneur's familiarity and their perception of knowledge influences the decisions they make.
How did you go about conducting the study to find that information?
Right. And this is where CIBER was enormously helpful to me. And so I knew that it's very difficult to study entrepreneurs. And so I looked at entrepreneurs and people who are studying entrepreneurship, specifically MBAs. And so I felt that they would have the prerequisite knowledge of background knowledge of business, and would have a kind of a dearth of knowledge about how to internationalize a business, much like an entrepreneur. So I interviewed MBAs and I interviewed actual entrepreneurs, and between the two of them, I was able to get a sense of their use of heuristics. And CIBER was very helpful to help me and sponsor me in doing that research.
How did you go about selecting those subjects for the study?
A couple things. Number one, here at the Kelley School of Business, we have a fantastic entrepreneurship center, the Johnson Center. And they have connections with lots of entrepreneurs all around the world, people who are former Kelley grads, people who are interested in Kelley. And they were able to hook me up with a lot of those and using the networks of Kelley in general. Also, I have access to a bunch of entrepreneurs through my own life because I'm a former entrepreneur myself. And I know a bunch of entrepreneurs, and so I was able to reach out to them. So between the two of them, I was able to get my sample.
And what were the initial findings from the research and the study?
Well, this is where things get interesting. Is we found that there were two very distinct factors, and that there's different stages to how entrepreneurs decide to internationalize. First is they have to basically accept the idea that they want to internationalize, and then figure out what are the possible areas of internationalization. And this is where we found previous experience is really important. That if you are if you have traveled, that you have a basic general understanding of the world and the differences in the world, it becomes much easier for you to figure out where there are good areas of fit. So international experience is very important on the front end of the various basic idea of where should I go. And then there's the analysis portion of it. And this is where you're trying to narrow down your list of possible selections. And we found that both the international experience, but where you think you know stuff, really starts to play in. So broad knowledge is important, but where you think you have knowledge really plays in, because you start bringing in, this is where the heuristics come in, where you start thinking, well, this is a bad fit because people in this country don't like this. And you start making broad generalizations, and you start filtering down your selection criteria based on those broad generalizations. And then, so you've narrowed down your decision, and then your final decision, generally based on, is where you think you know a lot more. And you want to go to where you're comfortable.
So you may have touched on this a little bit already, but what are some of the main takeaways from your study, and what does this mean for entrepreneurs?
Okay. The takeaways are pretty broad. Number one is, I don't think most people realize how much they have a tendency to simplify decisions based on generalizations, on broadly accepted things that they think they know. And this is where you actually get into making mistakes. So if you make a decision based on something you think you know, as opposed to something you know, this is where you're going to tend to make a very broad mistake. And number two is, I think people underestimate the value of just going out and experiencing the world. If you want to internationalize, if you want to go outside and expand your company, there's no substitute for just taking a trip someplace and really getting an understanding of what the place is like and what drives the people there and how they live their lives. And doing that a few times to a couple different countries can really inform you where you think your company would fit in.
So what are the next steps for your research then?
We're really interested in that middle step, the analysis step, because this is where knowledge and heuristics interact with each other. And this is where we're going to go a lot further and really try and understand the dimensions of the heuristics and how they interplay with our desires and how they get influenced by different levels of experience and different levels of knowledge, and how objective and subjective knowledge really play into each other. So this is that part of the area of the process that we're really focused on, because, as I said, this is where the errors filter in and how we can minimize those errors, or at least identify the risks of those errors.
Okay, so is there anything else you would like to tell our listeners today?
Just that I've really enjoyed this, that entrepreneurial internationalization is both a fantastic subject for entrepreneurs, because this is where the big growth is. The United States is an amazing market, but it is only about 20% of the world's market. And that companies that really want to grow, that really want to explore the full dimensions and possibilities of businesses, do need to internationalize. And understanding how and why and the best processes of internationalization is, I think, both an area of interesting research, but an area of practically important research to entrepreneurs.
Great. Well, thank you for speaking with us today, Dan.
Thank you so much.
So that's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.